Hello, this is Artur Kwasikoff again, and this is part 26 of Delzhi in 44 Letters. Thank you for joining me. I am happy to be continuing working on the back half of this series, and the next few letters in this alphabet are pretty dynamic. They have a lot of interesting uses phonetically, they have interesting associations with their symbols and what they mean, and there's going to be a lot more to cover and quite a bit more linguistic complexity on the horizon, which will be a little bit of a challenge, but I think this letter is a perfect warm up for that, since it incorporates some concepts that I've brought up previously in previous letters about sounds and meaning and reading and interpretation that might be difficult for people who don't use different writing systems and maybe don't speak languages that have multiple sounds that don't exist in their own language. So let's look at this letter. This is the 26th letter, and it is called kan, which is spelt with the English Latin letters QAN. And I have done my little drawing today in some lovely gold and spring green, just because it's that time of year here as I'm recording this. And if you can't tell by this beautiful golden line drawing I've done, this is a porcupine, and that is because the local dialect Dena'ina word for porcupine is kanchi, and that is exactly where the name of the letter comes from. And the shape of this letter, if you can sort of tell, it's this jagged, almost like a letter E or number 3 that's a bit flipped and has an extra angle, but they're all very pointy, and that's to represent kind of like this silhouette of the back half of a porcupine with its quills, but a very minimized version. And this drawing here is a porcupine scooting its way up a birch tree in spring. I just felt like being a lot more scenic with my drawing today. So we're going to go ahead and draw the letter kan because it is pretty easy, and I'm going to use my same spring green pen. Well, actually, I'll switch to this dark green pen just so it's easy to tell what I've just written. So now this is a pretty simple letter, and I start at this point up here on the top, and I kind of go up at a 45-degree angle, down again, and then to the side again, and then down right 45 degree, down left 45 degree, and then over right again to meet where this second line roughly lines up. And that is the letter kan, the capital. And the lowercase version is just the first 3 lines from the top. 1, 2, 3. Very simple. I like this letter because it's very straightforward, it's easy to do, and it is reminiscent enough of Latin letters that people who write with Latin letters are going to have an easy time to make for themselves and commit to memory. It's one that you can commit to memory. It doesn't involve a lot of curves or subtle changes in elevation and pitch or whatever those technical terms are in typography. So let's go into about the letter itself and the sound. Kanchi, which I've written here, kan, ang, nak, chi, is, you can write that word using letters that we've covered so far in the alphabet. So you should be able to write the word kanchi. It's only 5 letters in Delzhi, as opposed to 6, which it is in transliteration with Latin letters. And the sound is a little bit similar to cases where we've looked at where there's been 2 similar sounds before, but this one is a little bit different because it's not just a case of an aspirated versus an unaspirated sound. This is actually a case of difference in the location of where we say this letter. Now, kan is called, or the sound Q in phonetics, is called an aspirated back velar. And that means we kind of make it in the back of our mouth here. And so here's my mouth diagram. Here's nose, lips, teeth. Here's the tongue. And so it's similar to the sound we make with the letter K, but the letter K is pronounced more towards the middle of the roof of our mouth, and the Q is a little bit farther back, heading towards the throat. And for most people who speak languages like English, and this is true for me, have a very hard time listening to languages like Dena'ina and having the ability to tell the difference between the two sounds, because having two separate letters for these sounds is important, not just in this system, but also in the study of phonetics. As you can see, there's a K and a Q, because that subtle shift in the location of the mouth where we make this sound can change the definition of words. And so it's important that we mark that they're completely separate sounds phonetically, and they're completely separate letters in written language. And the easiest example of that is the words ken and ken. And even for me, I still have a hard time hearing the difference between these things. I can speak the difference pretty well now, but hearing it even for me is difficult. And so ken, if we look at the letter with the letter ken, also the same name of the letter we learned earlier, that's a bit like our in English K, is a word for a clearing or a type of a marsh or flat open area or plain. It's a ken, and if it's attached to a descriptive word, it can become kena. So it would be like something kena, just means a clearing or a flat in some location. But if you shift that sound to the back of the throat and make it more of the kan sound, which is represented in phonetics by the Q, it becomes ken. And ken is like a short form term that you would use a bit like a pronoun, and it's a pronoun that you use for a husband or some kind of male significant other. And it can be a kind of a suffix, it can be kind of a title. And again, we don't have a lot of living context for this language anymore, because it's the way it has been spoken historically is extinct. So we're not exactly sure how it would be used in a colloquial sense, but that's kind of what the recorded definitions are. It's kind of a name or a pronoun for a male loved one in a kind of a partnership or marriage type of situation. So if you say those two words, ken and ken, they mean different things even though they sound similar. But you could also probably put them together and make a ken a husband place, which I imagine is a bit like a shopping mall where they have a lot of those benches outside of the large department stores where that people sometimes call jokingly as like the husband's waiting area. So I can think of that as a ken. And just to kind of further elaborate on that, I just wrote here Q is not equivalent to K, but it's also not equivalent to the aspirated Q, which even though this is described as an aspirated letter phonetically, because we kind of go k, k, and we use that little bit of breath, there actually is a glottalized version that has a more pronounced aspiration, and that's actually the letter that we're going to cover next. And so it's just another layer of complexity where we have these two pairs of letters making four total that all have a similar form and function. And another note that I wrote down here is the reason why these K sounds and Q sounds are so frequently found at the beginning of words in languages like Dena'ina is because they are a bit of evidence of how, when people historically have named things or given things terms or had to invent words for things, they would use this sound as a kind of an article. And the basic articles we have in English are a and the. And so those are somewhat easy to understand. They're a little bit challenging for kids to learn the difference between the and a, like the specific versus the general. Well, there's many classifications of types of either prefixes or articles that exist in languages, and in Dena'ina, this kind of sound, when it's at the beginning of words, it can usually be traced to being a word invented from another word, and it loosely means in the likeness of. And so, for example, this is not really a porcupine, but it's a hedgehog, but I thought it was the cutest and closest thing I have, and it's in a pretty green that I like. So if I would say that this color, this kind of a sagey sea glass green, let's pretend I'm doing this in English. And so I want to say, I need to name this color. I've not seen it before. I'm going to give it a name. Well, I think it looks a bit like weathered sea glass, a bit. And so I'm going to say the name of the color is sea glass. And so you can see how that evolution would happen, where I'm not saying this is sea glass, I'm saying this is something in the likeness of sea glass. And that's a really rudimentary example of how a lot of these Dena'ina words have come to be, and why the k sound is just so everywhere. It dominates the known dictionaries of both historic and recently spoken language. And I drew a little drawing here of carrots because my dog Truffle, who is right by me at the moment, his favorite thing to do at night, it's like his little ritual, is he wants to have a snack on a fresh carrot. And so every night I have to chop a fresh carrot for him. And it feels a bit like a chore sometimes because it's only when I'm already really tired and it's late. But it's just his thing. It's what he does. He goes to the bathroom, and when we get back inside, he has a carrot, and then he goes to bed. And it's like a routine. And so I have to tell myself, in order for me to be able to get to bed and for my dog to be happy, I need to keep cutting carrots. And if you can hear that phrase in your throat, the word keep, it starts with that really strong K, and you can almost feel like the sides of your tongue touching your upper teeth at the two opposite sides of your mouth. And then cutting, which is what we spell with a C, that's closer to what this Q sound is, this con sound. It's almost like your tongue is just rearing up in the back of your mouth like it's a horse ready to start a race. And then carrots is an interesting word because it sounds like it's a little bit in between the both. And so this is a really good example of explaining how phonetic letters, even though we make diagrams like this to show where they're articulated, we never really know exactly for sure, because these pinpoints are only like markers of a general range of where a sound is made. And that's how different accents and styles of speaking develop over time, is really these are just marks on a continuum. So you can imagine there was an infinite number of sounds that could be made with smacking your tongue all over from the front of your teeth to the very back of your throat as far as you could, safely without choking, of course. But imagine there's like hundreds of thousands of sounds that you could possibly chart. But we only need to mark certain small sections because those are the sections that sound different enough for us to make sense of differentiating information from. And so that's how languages change over time, is none of these things and sounds, and even when children are learning sounds in school and they go to kindergarten and they learn the alphabet and learn sound, even every new generation that walks into that classroom every year is gonna slightly hear a different sound. And because generations generally evolve their own language within their own age group, they're gonna take that information, decide amongst themselves, okay, the adults and the teacher say that this letter sounds like this, so we're gonna say the sound, but we also have to be able to understand each other. And so part of children socializing in school is that kind of language acquisition, where it's not just learning it from a book like I like to do or recordings, it's learning it from each other. And that's something that I like to point out to people a lot is part of learning a language involves the social aspect. You can't just learn it dry from extinct sources. It's not possible. All you can do is just learn about it and maybe find ways to incorporate it into your life in a symbolic way. So over time, those different sets of kids, each one coming into school, new year, might just have slightly micrometer shifts in how they hear those sounds. And because they listen to the children above them who are older talk and learn from them too, they're going to adapt those changes that they have already made, that the older kids have already made. And as long as it's close enough to whatever is being taught and understood by the adults, they're going to go with that. And so that is exactly how language can change over time. And it can seem like even within the span of 2 or 3 generations, language can sound and hear differently. And if anybody wants to really get a feeling for that, because in school and in college people learn about Middle English and the Renaissance and Elizabethan English and even Victorian English and how those are a bit hard for us to understand now. These changes, they happen a lot faster than people think. And if you were to stop and think about what's a current TV show or movie that you've watched recently and how the people talk in that, and you compare it to a movie or a TV show from 30, 40 years ago, just that shift alone in the way people speak, the subtleties of their emphasis, maybe there's certain vowels that people pronounce longer or hold on to longer, maybe they shorten things a bit more. But once you really start to watch those things just to listen to people talk, you don't even need a visual. You'll hear the difference in the change over time, and it's really shocking, especially if you're somebody like me who grew up watching something and you go back to it now, nearly 40 years later, and you think, oh my God, to me these people sounded completely normal, but now compared to how I talk and how people talk around me today, it feels a little bit different. It feels a little bit weird, and you'd almost feel like you'd be out of place if you were in that universe, even though it's something that you grew up with and understood to be the neutral, the normal. That was a long tangent. And the last thing I want to look at before the end of this video is, of course, the porcupine as symbol. The porcupine is one of my favorite animals of all time. I love porcupines and hedgehogs and echidnas, and I'm kind of known for that being my thing. And I really love the North American porcupine, which is pretty common, I guess, across North America, duh, because it is very important in our culture historically. It is the animal that I associate with the people here themselves. And to me, it is kind of like our national animal in a way, because I believe that that's kind of how we are. We're very... porcupines are very independently minded, very self-sustaining, very not very overly communal. We're just not a communal people, and I don't think we ever have been. We've been very all about just efficiency and self-enterprise and just independence and protection, and that's what porcupines symbolize. And they're also fairly spiritual figures, and to not get too much of that about that, I have talked about the roles of animals in the past in culture and symbolism, and this is one of the cases where we can dip a little bit more into the ephemeral and esoteric definitions, because porcupines can be considered, locally at least, to be the most historically associated with divinity, and people in the past used to actually, hunt them for food, but also for needles and fur, because they had very warm fur, and also needles used to make tools and patterns, and they would either become the beads themselves, they would use them as needles. So the porcupine, the parts are very useful. That's not really a common thing done now. It's pretty We more or less say, we have other stuff we can use that's pretty sustainable and vegan, dare I say. Even though I'm not a vegan, I do like to incorporate more vegan things in my life. Um, but that is what it was used historically for. And one of those uses that we have kind of lost the art form for over the year was to use their bones, specifically their hip bones, as kind of like dice, and specifically dice used in divination. And in the previous video of the letter L, where I talked about the use of smoke and burning roots for divination practices, that's also true of porcupine bones, because they are just seen as this animal that has this divine connotation. And even when the porcupine is used as a character in fable stories, and I say character and not, it's not considered like it's not considered like a type of a god or a spirit necessarily. It's, you could think of the porcupine as a character in a fictional universe, and that fictional universe is where fables and lessons would be derived from. They're not necessarily spiritual figures themselves, although individual species and animals can have spirits and do have spirits. The idea of the character of the porcupine is more like, let's say, Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars universe. It's fictionalized. It's not. We're not talking about a real porcupine's spirit. But anyways, so if you imagine this, the character of the porcupine is fairly common in at least the most recorded and remembered fables, and the role of its character is pretty interesting because it's not one that gets into a lot of hijinks. It's not one that is silly. It's not a buffoon. It doesn't have it's like a character of persistence and cooperation, and it's kind of there just happily observing along. And it's kind of hard to explain because I only know a couple of porcupine stories, and they're very short. Because most of these fables and spiritual information were just completely wiped out, mostly by force, and so we don't know for sure what the canon is, so to speak, of these symbols. But from what has been taught to me and what I have been able to absorb is that the porcupine is almost like a mirror of people. He's a bit, or she is a bit like an animal who is a part of some kind of lesson or scenario that is often a part of the resolution, or is a reminder of like the process of nature and needing to get things done kind of regardless of what the silliness around happening is. And I kind of like that role of the porcupine. And so to me, that's why it's a very important figure, not just in terms of the local environment. They're very important to the local environment. We have them everywhere, and I love to see them when they appear. They're kind of skitterish and shy, and they keep to themselves. And they're just probably my favorite local animal. And I think the last thing that I want to kind of mention about them is maybe a little bit gruesome, but I'm recording this in spring, and in spring and summer, porcupines are fairly nocturnal, and they do like to, unfortunately, cross some of the busier roads at night, and people do tend to hit them, and you do tend to see porcupines hit by cars on the road, which is kind of sad. But I think, to me, in a weird way, because I thought about this for a long time in my life, because I'm just never able to reconcile that kind of sadness I feel, because it feels like just people generally don't care. I'm sure people care, but I think, to me, because the porcupine is not a domestic animal, nor is it one that is being purposely hunted anymore, and thank God we don't need to, I still do feel sad, because I feel like people kind of treat it like an afterthought. And then I kind of realized one day, considering that and thinking about some of the stories about porcupines and its historical uses, and I kind of realized, porcupines are very determined creatures, and I can't think of an animal that is more brave in a way, because if this porcupine and porcupines are so if they're so dedicated to crossing roads, even when it's fairly dangerous, and the species hasn't really adapted to that very well at all in any way yet. But they still do it anyways, and they're still going for it, and they're still taking the risk. There's kind of a weird sense of admiration I have, and I'd like to think that that kind of describes who we are as a collective, and in our just individuality. It's like maybe it's a little bit random and happenstance, and not exactly a cohesive tourism campaign friendly type of culture. But if you have a culture that's made up of entirely of these people that are just going to keep crossing the road no matter what, I think that's kind of a neat thing. And so when I was able to kind of understand that and tell that to myself, I realized, oh, this is a really excellent allegory for kind of the contemporary human spirit, because that's kind of what we're doing now. Okay, I have gone on way too long. There was lots of parts and moving pieces to that one, but I'm happy that you stuck it out with me if you did. And I cannot wait to see you for more videos. Thank you.